In moments of disaster, true heroes often emerge, not with capes or superpowers, but with courage, compassion, and a willingness to act when others hesitate. This inspiring story follows Daniel, a 13-year-old boy who risked his life to save two elderly neighbors during a devastating flood. His bravery not only brought hope to his community, but also proved that even the smallest actions can make a world of difference. Share this powerful story with friends and family. They may find the courage to step up in their own lives. Don't forget to save this story. You never know when it might remind you or someone else that they too can be a hero. Now, dive into Daniel's unforgettable journey of bravery, hope, and resilience. The rain had been falling relentlessly for days. Streets had turned into rivers, and the sky remained dark and heavy. In a small town known for its peaceful streets, the storm threatened to destroy everything. Amid the chaos, 13-year-old Daniel found himself watching from his front porch, his worried gaze fixed on the rising water. "Daniel, step away from the window," his father, Marcus, called from the kitchen. "It's dangerous out there." Daniel knew better than to argue, but his mind was restless. Memories of the last major flood played on repeat, when his uncle had been swept away in the currents. Since then, Daniel had felt a quiet determination to help others in times of trouble. A loud knock startled him. Rushing to the door, Daniel saw Mr. Wallace, a neighbor, standing in knee-deep water. "Daniel," Mr. Wallace shouted, "have you seen Mrs. Jenkins? She's still in her house and no one's seen her since yesterday." Daniel's heart raced. Mrs. Jenkins was an elderly woman who lived alone. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his raincoat and rushed out. "Daniel!" his father called, but Daniel was already gone. The water was icy and strong, tugging at his legs as he waded through the flooded street. Reaching Mrs. Jenkins's home, he banged on the door. "Mrs. Jenkins, are you in there?" A faint voice answered. "Daniel? I can't open the door. The water's pushing against it." Thinking fast, Daniel climbed onto a window ledge and pried it open. Water pooled inside the house, swirling around Mrs. Jenkins's feet. "Come on! We've got to get out of here," Daniel urged, grabbing her arm. With great effort, Daniel helped Mrs. Jenkins out of the window and through the waist-deep flood waters. Debris floated past them, and Daniel tightened his grip to keep her steady. Eventually, they reached dry ground, where neighbors helped Mrs. Jenkins to safety. "You're a brave boy," Mrs. Jenkins said breathlessly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." But Daniel's eyes shifted to another house further down the road. Mr. Green's place. He was known as a quiet man, hardly ever speaking to anyone. Yet Daniel remembered seeing him struggle with a cane just days ago. Without a word, Daniel sprinted toward the house. "Mr. Green!" Daniel shouted, hammering on the door. No answer. Water was already pouring through the lower windows. Daniel found a side window partially open and forced himself inside. "Mr. Green!" he called again. He found the elderly man upstairs, clutching a photograph of his late wife. "I can't make it on my own," Mr. Green muttered weakly. "I'll help you," Daniel said firmly. "But we have to move now." With Mr. Green's arm over his shoulder, Daniel led him through the flooded house. By the time they emerged, the water was rising rapidly. Daniel guided Mr. Green to the nearest rescue point, ignoring the biting cold. Later that evening, Daniel returned home, exhausted and drenched. His father stood on the porch, waiting for him. "I told you to stay inside," Marcus scolded. But before Daniel could reply, Mr. Green approached, wrapped in a blanket. "Your son saved my life," Mr. Green said with a shaky voice. "I would have died if he hadn't come for me." Marcus's stern face softened, and he pulled Daniel into a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you," he murmured. The next morning, a sleek black car arrived at their doorstep. A sharply dressed woman stepped out, carrying a large envelope. "I'm Mrs. Preston," she introduced herself. "My father, Mr. Green, told me what your son did. We can't let that go unnoticed. This," she said, handing over the envelope, "is a contribution to help the families in this neighborhood rebuild." News of Daniel's actions spread quickly, and neighbors came together to clean, repair, and rebuild. Inspired by Daniel's bravery, volunteers from nearby towns arrived to lend a hand. Walls were repaired, streets were cleared, and smiles gradually returned to the faces of those who once feared they had lost everything. One afternoon, as Daniel was helping repaint a neighbor's fence, Mr. Green approached him. "Daniel," he said, "I spent too many years keeping to myself. I thought I didn't need anyone, but you showed me that no one can face everything alone." "Thank you." Daniel smiled modestly. "I just did what I had to do, sir." "No," Mr. Green said firmly. "You did what a hero does. You gave people hope." As Daniel watched children play in the newly restored park and neighbors chatting like family, he realized that a single act of kindness had changed his entire community. And though he didn't think of himself as a hero, he knew that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply step forward when someone needs you the most. The weeks that followed were busy as Daniel continued helping his neighbors. From assisting Mr. Wallace to clean debris to organizing volunteers to rebuild damaged roofs, Daniel's presence became a symbol of hope in the community. One evening, as Daniel sat on his front porch, Mrs. Jenkins approached with a basket of warm bread. "For you and your family?" she smiled. "I wouldn't be here without you." Daniel accepted the gift with a smile. He didn't feel like a hero, but he understood that doing what was right could leave a lasting impact, and that feeling of unity and purpose became something he cherished deeply. In the years to come, Daniel's quiet courage and selflessness would become a story that parents told their children, a reminder that even the smallest acts of bravery can create ripples of change that extend far beyond what we can imagine.